Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everyone to this memorial panel for Professor Lyn Ragsdale. It's sad, but it's very appropriate that we're here, and it's a pleasure for me to chair as we share our experiences about Lyn and all that she meant to us and to the discipline. I just want to do a quick introduction. Almost everybody here certainly about it, but since this is being recorded for anyone who might run across it. Lyn was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and grew up in Tempe, Arizona. She graduated from Tempe High School in 1971, and she was the first in her family to go to college, obtaining a BS in political science with high honors from Arizona State, an MA and a PhD from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. She received the latter in 1982. In 83, she joined the political science faculty at the University of Arizona. From 88 to 91, she served as director of the University of Arizona Survey Research Center, and she was the head of the political science department at the University of Illinois, Chicago from 2001 to 2006. From 2006 to 2016, she served as the Dean of Social Sciences at Rice University, and she was the first woman to hold that position. In 2017, after stepping down as dean, she returned to her passions of teaching, research, and writing. She was past president of the Western Political Science Association and served as co-editor of Political Research Quarterly from 1996 to 2000. She was an APSA Congressional Fellow in 1990 to 91 and a Russell Sage Fellow in 84 to 85. In 2019, she received the Betty Moulds Award for contribution to the profession from the Western Political Science Association. And as a member of the Presidency and Executive Politics section, I looked it up. In 1995, she was our section chair, and in 2012, she served as president of the section. She was a scholar on American politics, the presidency, and electoral behavior. She authored The American Non-Voter out of Oxford University Press with her husband, Gerald Rusk. Vital Statistics on the American Presidency, 4 editions, which I'll have a little bit more to say about in a second. Presidential Politics, a textbook on the subject, which was published in 1993, and The Elusive Executive, Discovering Statistical Patterns in the Presidency from CQ Press, along with one of our panelists, Gary King. And at the time that she was taken from us far too soon, she was working on her latest book, which was entitled Shattered, Donald Trump and the American Presidency. I knew her only a little bit, and mostly about, but her work had an enormous impact on my career. I had this idea on Tuesday before coming to, before heading to Seattle, and I thought, oh, okay, I got to do this. And then, of course, I'm sure all of you know, especially if you're as disorganized as I sometimes can be, I had to hurry up, and it escaped my mind, and I was going to ask my youngest son, who is also at Drury University, where I teach, if he would go in and find my copy of the 3rd edition of Vital Statistics on the Presidency. I have books, I think, from just about almost everybody on this panel, and no offense to anyone, but hers was the most dog-eared. The spine was broken and had been taped back several times. It is not, you always hear this, my book or this would not have been possible. The book that I had published just a few years ago literally would not have been possible without her work, and a lot of my other research and certainly my teaching would not have been the same without her work. So I had a chance to see her at an APSA. I don't remember when it was, but I found myself, it was on a shuttle, and I sat down and I saw her name tag, and I just had to introduce myself and thank her. I was at the University of Colorado Springs for 13 years. And now I'm back in my hometown, a small liberal arts college called Drury University. And in both places, research is valued, but there's not a lot of money for travel. So I just wanted to thank her for doing that, those books, because like I said, my work would not have been possible, or certainly would have taken a lot longer and been a lot more harder and more expensive if it wasn't for her. So as somebody who only had a chance to interact with her a few times, she's had an enormous impact on my work. So it is my great pleasure to introduce the members of the panel. And we're kind of going in roughly chronological order, and while nothing exactly lines up in nice even categories, obviously relationships spill over categorical boundaries. We're going to start with her when she went to the University of Wisconsin. So we're going to start with Robert Browning and then move on to Gary King. And to people who interacted with her greatly in at least the presidency section, we'll move to Karen Hult of Virginia Tech and Martha Kumar of Towson. Then as a student and mentee of hers, Lara Brown of George Washington University, and we'll conclude with her colleague at Rice, Paul Brace. So with that, I want to turn it over to Robert Browning.
Okay. I wrote some of these things on the memorial site, but I first met Lyn Ragsdale when she was a new graduate student at the University of Wisconsin in 1977. She had just come there as a grad student, as you know. We hit it off right away. We had a lot of interest in the same things: politics, political science, cooking, other adventures. And she already had a very strong background in political science. I could tell that she was very well educated as an undergraduate. She was a TA in her first semester for constitutional law. She took everything about school very seriously. I remember her saying during the last week of the semester, "This week belongs to the students." She was dedicated to her students and worked hard to help them. Once, however, a student asked her, "Why are you in graduate school? Could you not get into law school?" I still remember the steam coming out of her ears as she told that story. She was so committed to the career in political science. I can remember the first course in administrative law. I'm not exactly sure why she took that course. I think she had expressed an interest in law, and they thought we should take a course from David Feldman, who was a crusty old law professor. And on the first day where we got our exams back, she left the class very quickly, and I couldn't reach her for the rest of the day. And later in the night, I reached her, and she said she admitted that she didn't do well, and that her father was had a service station, and she had gasoline in her veins. And so she went out riding in her car to get rid of her frustrations, and she got a speeding ticket, and she was double frustrated by both her exam performance and getting pulled over by the cops. But I never heard her have another bad grade, though. She was noticed by her professors, Leon Epstein, Murray Edelman, Jack Dennis, Gina Shapiro, and especially Barbara Hinckley. We grew very close to Barbara Hinckley, met her for drinks and discussed all matters of politics, department politics, the profession, and we spent out many research ideas. Lyn was at the center of all those discussions and organizations. She, myself, Tim Cook, Diane Kaiser, and later Gary King were always hanging out together, taking courses or sitting on the Union Terrace at the Union. Throughout our last year, the TA union went on strike. It didn't turn out well. The union was decertified, but Lyn was very committed to the cause. The semester ended abruptly because we had to return to class to finish the semester, but she was consumed by the experience and the commitment into the cause. I knew Lyn would be successful. She told me early that she wanted to be a dean or an administrator. She published while a grad student, was invited to conferences, began to make a name for herself right away. She was always generous with her time, counseled many graduate students and undergraduates, as you've learned. She was very insightful and ready to help with any project. She left us much too soon, but left so many memories and affected us so much. Gone from our earth, but never forgotten, our Lyn Ragsdale.
Thank you, Robert. Gary?
Thanks, Robert. That was really great. The contrast between the great folks that are assembled here today and the horrible circumstances that bring us together is pretty jarring. Let me mention that Lyn and Jerry's son and Tracy's nephew, if they're watching, is Matthew, who's a professional dancer in the St. Louis Ballet Company and can't be here today, which is one of the reasons we're recording this. Matthew, I got to know you when you were too small to remember, but I thought you might enjoy some of these stories about your mom. Matthew, I hear, is 28 years old. When I was 20 years old, I drove from SUNY New Paltz in New York to Madison, Wisconsin to start graduate school. I was lucky to meet Bob Browning, but I was lucky to be assigned as a research assistant and to get a carrel in the 4th floor office in North Hall, where Lyn Ragsdale had a carrel as well. I mean, Lyn was to graduate only 2 years after I arrived, but I got 2 years of terrific advice in that room. I mean, in my experience, Lyn was the quintessential adult in the room. In that room at UW-Madison before she was actually an adult, and in pretty much every other room since. What this meant is that when Lyn was not around, one of us or someone would often say, wait, we can't do that. Lyn will think we're being silly. And then we would come up with a different plan. I can't tell you how many times I vividly remember that. I remember Diane, who Robert mentioned, saying that quite a lot. Lyn was a role model, a source of advice, and the leading proof to those of us who just got assigned offices to be research assistants at an early age, that it was possible to succeed in the profession. Lyn taught me how universities worked, how to talk to faculty who seemed 100 years older than me, to prepare job talks, to apply for jobs, to negotiate with the prospective employers, all kinds of things. We went off to my first political science conference. I think it was Cincinnati, where four of us, Robert and Tim and Lyn, and packed into a teeny little car, went off to the Midwest Political Science Association. And for years, we had a frequent flyer pass at the Palmer House in Chicago, where we'd meet for conferences. About the least surprising thing that has happened in all of the decades since is that Lyn has held a sequence of responsible administrative positions, including chair and dean and et cetera. I mean, if there had been a vote in graduate school about the person most likely to become a dean, it would have been Lyn, no question, no question. It was just obvious. Although Lyn became an administrator, she's also going to live on through her scholarly ideas. I got to watch some of these when they were forming. Lyn and I got to write a book together, as Dan mentioned, but also through Lyn's many articles and lots of things, lots of other scholarship. But let me explain for Matthew especially, because Matthew, your mom was a leader in academic social movement that produced a massive intellectual change in the field. It wasn't only her, but that's the way academia works. Originally, the study of the presidency was considered a backwater in the social scientific study of politics and society. Lyn's model was Lyn's work was a model of some of the first scholarship to change this. When Lyn began graduate school, there were lots of visible books and articles about the presidency, as there are now. However, all but a few were impressionistic and sort of hard to distinguish from, pretty good journalism. Lyn was at the front lines. Your mom, Matthew, was at the front lines of leading what became the movement to make the study of the presidency scientific. At the time, other subfields, but not the presidency, were ramping up to learn how to quantify evidence and define quantities of conceptual interest and to precisely measure them and to use modern statistical methods to estimate these quantities and their uncertainties. But the movement was not about quantification only, which Lyn did plenty of. It was also about collecting qualitative evidence and analyzing it in systematic ways. And she exemplified all of these things. The movement had barely touched the presidency subfield when she started. She aimed to change this, and she showed the way. She recognized this and began to move the discipline through her scholarship and teaching and university leadership and mentorship and advice to friends, and even who she was, and even making some folks just a little fearful that looking silly in front of the adult in the room might be the wrong thing. This study of the presidency can still be improved in lots and lots of ways. But the contrast from before Lyn to, I'm afraid, after Lyn or after Lyn's impact is really stunning. The amount of systematic scientific knowledge we now have about the US presidency and democracy and elections in general is vastly more than when we were in graduate school. We know how to scientifically evaluate public policies, how to advise people willing to work in the executive branch, how to explain to students and citizens how democracy works. We even know how to figure out whether elections were run fairly and were stolen. New 20-something-year-old graduate students now know so much more and can start on the shoulders of Lyn and lots of others. They're so much better because of the movement that she helped lead. But it isn't only about graduate students. Matthew, it is literally true that hundreds of years from now, when people have forgotten us, they'll have forgotten your mom, they'll have forgotten everybody here, social scientists and citizens of democracy all over the world will look back on this era as the one that changed the social sciences from a bunch of people in ivory towers studying stuff to social scientists who discover new knowledge about the world, including the most important political institution in the most powerful nation on earth, the American presidency. And hundreds of years from now, anyone who takes the time to look at the scholarly literature will be thankful for your mom's leadership in making this movement happen. The feeling that you're studying something important mattered. It mattered to me back then. I remember going into an oral exam, oral exams, right? There's 3 famous faculty and there's at the time it was a 21-year-old something, right? Walking into the exam. And I had seen a telethon. Do you remember, Matthew may not remember telethons, but there were telethons where Jerry Lewis and others would try to convince people to give money for muscular dystrophy or some other important cause. And in part with this idea that we had to be doing something important, and we had to be doing it in a way in which we could learn something. I walked into this exam and I asked questions instead of answering them. I said, so why don't we have any telethons for political science research? Like, why are we watching telethons for curing diseases and we have, and of course that was like a really impertinent question, and it sounded silly. It wasn't silly in Lyn's sense though. It was silly in the faculty sense, and the faculty were all defensive, of course. It was great. It was great a great way to take an exam because any time you devoted to that, they couldn't ask you questions you didn't know the answers to. But it was the sense in which whatever it is we were studying, however it is we were studying it, it was an important thing. One last story. The only time I remember thinking that Lyn was mad at me or actually thought I was being silly, was during an especially busy time. She and I were writing The Elusive Executive on a deadline. We were working sort of around the clock. She'd wake up on the West Coast to what I wrote the night before, and I'd wake up at NYU, where I was teaching at the time, to what she wrote the night before. And during this, I once noticed that she had completely bungled a paragraph. It made no sense, and it was pretty funny. So I sent it to her, and I said, "Hey, look at what you wrote." I meant it as a joke, and she emailed me back in a way that I thought she was mad at me. Like, this mattered to me. Like, it really mattered to me. I mean, of course, it turned out later that Lyn's reaction was Lyn being mad at herself. So she wasn't mad at me. But I relate this story, this silly story, only because something like I don't know, 30 years later, I remember that it bothered me. And I thought that Lyn might be displeased with me. She was our role model. It was only, if only in who she was and in our desire for her to know that we were doing the right thing, she motivated us and all those around her. So my best to Jerry and Matthew and Tracy and the rest of Lyn's family and friends. The world was lucky to have had the chance to interact with her for as long as it turned out to be possible. And I was lucky to have learned so much from her. So thanks for this opportunity today.
Thanks, Gary. Karen.
Thanks. It's very difficult to add to those wonderful and heartfelt words, Gary. I agree with so many of them. Thank you. And Robert as well. Clearly, there's a lot to say about Lyn, and I'm very honored to have the opportunity to add just a few words. It strikes me in terms of words, there are myriad words and phrases that immediately come to mind. Dan, you already mentioned one, passion. I'd add energy, curiosity, insight, engaged listening. I think all of those were exemplified by what Lyn did accomplished and how she dealt with her students, with us, and it sounds like with her family. I too heard so much of her excitement in talking about her son Matthew when they moved to Houston and going into the ballet and how that would open up so many opportunities for him. She was so excited, so committed, and so wanted to see the success that has come to bear. And I keep that in mind as well when I think about Lyn. Although I was familiar with Lyn's scholarship and saw her involvement with the Western Political Science Association when I was at Pomona College, it seems like eons ago. It was last century, but in the 1980s, my first real chance to interact with her was at the NewStack conference in 1996 at Columbia University. We rode the subway back and forth from our hotel. We listened to presentations. We talked over meals. And Gary, I remember you being around the table as well. It was such fun, and I learned so much, and I'm so drawn to her enthusiasm and commitment and willingness to engage in careful and thoughtful listening. It was a wonderful experience. Over the years, we had numerous similar kinds of discussions. For example, there's a theme here, but I'm not going to emphasize it too much. For example, over wine in the Palmer House at Midwest in Chicago, and at meals and at the Palace Cafe and Commander's Palace in New Orleans at the Southern Political Science Association, and of course at Presidency Research Group and Presidency and Executive Politics section meetings at the APSA. As a junior scholar with growing interest in the US presidency and the executive branch, and really thinking about those as arenas for my further exploring my own ideas and expectations about organizational, institutional, and policy dynamics. Like Dan, I benefited an awful lot from Lyn's work with Gary in the Elusive Executive, and then later with that dog-eared volume that you mentioned, Dan, The Vital Statistics on the Presidency. That was simply critical to our being able to ground our own scholarship and our thinking in the developmental patterns, the continuities and discontinuities that have taken place in the US presidency and in the institution of the presidency embedded in the context of US politics over time. At the same time, Lyn's scholarship, for example, on presidential speech making, on elections, and on public approval provided important grounding and context for a lot of our work. It also offered a kind of a clear-eyed and well-informed appreciation of the actual possibilities and dynamics of US politics and institutions that was reinforced by and built upon Lyn's experience as a congressional fellow, as well as a Russell Sage fellow. All of that appears in her later work, it seems like, in building bridges between scholarship and practice, whether it's in the Masters of Global Affairs program at Rice that joins the Baker Center and the School of Social Sciences, or doing a variety of other things. That link between the two strikes me as so very important. As an organizational and institutional theorist, I was especially drawn to Lyn's work on the evolution of the presidency. I first read what became The Institutional of the American Presidency, 1924 to 1992, that she wrote with John Tice as a panel discussant at the Midwest Political Science Association. Ultimately, that article was published in HAPS in 1997, and it's become a familiar and indeed I'd say mandatory site in literature that talks about the evolution, development, and in some cases, lack of development in the US presidency and its surrounding structures. The last time I looked early in the week, it had almost 200 sites on Google Scholar. Like much of her work, it not only made changes at the time it was published, it also continues to be work that we go back, read, draw upon, and try to build upon as well. That's very important. At the same time, as Dan, Gary, and others have said, as an undergraduate teacher of the US presidency, I've relied upon Lyn's work through the years, from the graph statistics and table in Vital Statistics in the Elusive Executive, but also more recently on Lyn's essay in Michael Nelson's reader, Why Do Presidents Need Political Scientists? She's not yet convinced the undergraduates I teach that having a presidential advisor in the West Wing makes a lot of sense. And yet just last week, several of them asked me after we finished that essay, so what is it that political scientists these days are saying about the US presidency? I couldn't answer as well as Lyn, but I certainly was ready to answer and was delighted that they asked the question. The final thing I want to mention, that it seems to me was also so critical about Lyn's role as a member of our profession, was her work as a supporter of and advocate for women in the profession. At the same time, as Gary discussed, she was an outspoken voice for the importance of social science evidence and analysis of critical policy and political and policy dynamics. That was critical, certainly, in the 1970s, 1980s, and into the 1990s generally, but particularly, as Gary also said, in the study of the US presidency. We can think about eras as BL and AL, Gary, as you indicated, before Lyn and after Lyn. I'd hasten to add that Gary King would also be joined in that acronym of before and after. But in any event, Lyn and Gary and others really contributed to the work that we do as social scientists in studying the presidency and attempting to advance our knowledge of what goes on in that critical institution. In addition, Lyn was among the fairly small group of presidency and US institutional scholars in the 1980s and 1990s whose work appeared in the so-called top journals. Otherwise, as Gary said, we presidency scholars were seen as the backwaters, the mere journalists, if you will, of political science. And yet her work appeared in journals like APSR, AJPS, JOP, LSQ, and others. She, more than that, was one of the very few women of her time that was appearing in those journals and that made a strong case for the use of empirical analysis of both quantitative and qualitative data, using the best measures and techniques that we had available to us to make better sense of what's going on in US government. I think all of that was extraordinarily important. She brought those same qualities to her work as co-editor of the Political Research Quarterly, and certainly in her involvement with the Presidency Research Group and the President and Executive Politics section of the APSA. As Dan said, she was president of PEP in 2011, 2012, I think. She also was important to many of us, as several others on the screen have been as well, as a mentor, as an inspirational role model and faculty member, and that's as a department chair, as a colleague, as a practitioner, as a careful reader and thinker and teacher of the sorts of things we do. I have lots of things that I could add, but I know the rest of you have so much more to contribute here. So I'd like to just end by saying, it's very difficult for me, returning to where I began with the words to describe Lyn, to improve on Ashley Leeds' description of Lyn in PS, a passionate educator, researcher and administrator, and a mentor. I'd only suggest the additions of valued colleague, important role model, and treasured friend. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Karen. Now, Martha Kumar.
Okay, well, let me hold up my vital statistics with all of the post-its of places that I need to look. Lyn was a person dedicated to the four aspects of our profession: scholar, teacher, mentor, administrator. And there are very few who have effectively put together this combination, because it does require 60-hour weeks, but also it's a combination. It's a particular style, a style to gather the facts, know the people's needs and wants, and be able to assess situation. She brought all of these talents to all of her dealings, whether it was in university teaching or as an administrator or as a scholar. She was a leader and a star in all she did. We as presidency scholars, as all of you all really have been talking about, we have so much to thank her for getting our profession to go in additional routes to understand the institution of the presidency and also in White House operations. Prior to the work that she did and that Gary did, the the most often studies we had of the presidency were ones that would look at individual presidents and what individual presidents did. And by bringing all of the figures together that she did, even just looking at the figures, you can see the importance of comparative work, of understanding what is the difference from one president to another by the comparisons of whether it is the number of executive actions you take, but when you do so as well, that so much of what we know about the presidency, we follow from news reports, and news reports are focused on particular events, and you often have a repetition of points that are inaccurate. And so the work that they did gave you a different way of looking at things. And an example would be looking at Calvin Coolidge and his characterization as Silent Cal. But when you go back and you put information together of what he was doing during his time in office, and you find that he held press conferences, for example, if you compare all the presidents, that he had more press conferences than his predecessors or his successors for the amount of time that he was in office. He was far from silent. He regularly met with reporters, took them on vacation, and he felt that it was part of what a president did, was explaining to the people what is being done on their behalf. And so you don't have to take the myth. You can look at the evidence and see what really gets done. And so it's not surprising that the vital statistics fill the gap that it did, or that if the work is recognized as the best reference book, the Richard Neustadt Award for the best reference book. It has had an impact on us all, and we are very thankful for it. She helped her colleagues. I know in my case, there was an issue that I had. I don't want to go into, but that dealt with a grant, and she was very wise in her handling of it, and basically wanting to know what the facts are, working through what the alternatives are, and then who you can deal with. And one of the people, I've spoken with several people who worked with her over the years, in particularly in administrative and as positions and as colleagues. One of them described her style, because her style she really brought to everything. Her strong point was she was incredibly even-keeled. Many times, and we all know this from department meetings, many times people lose their temper, and with her, you never saw any escalation on her side. Things calmed down because of the approach that she took. Arguments never got out of hand. And that was a quality that she brought everywhere. She was an administrator, as you all have mentioned. She was, and Karen just talked about, that she was clearly an administrator from the start, that she headed the research center at the University of Arizona, went to the political science department in the University of Illinois at Chicago. And one of the people told me that what was so good about her is that she really knew what an administration that she was working with, what they needed and what they really didn't need and would just put in a file. So you therefore could judge what you should do by knowing through her sense of what was important. As an administrator, one person told me, as an administrator, she was level-headed. If she told you something, you knew it was fact. And if she told you she couldn't do something one year, but would do it the next, you could cross it off your list because you know that it would be implemented the next year. You didn't have to worry because she had your back. She was easy to work with, and she knew her administrations well. And as much as Jerry was saying that she worked 60-hour weeks, but in those 60 hours, she certainly had time as a mentor. Even if she wasn't teaching, she would be working on her research work, but would also be dealing with faculty members, but also with students. One of her students, graduate students from the University of Arizona, Leslie Schwint-Bayer, who followed her to Rice. And she said she ran an amazing American politics core course. I modeled my graduate courses on her approach for years. Her ability to help students revise and reshape their writing was invaluable. So she was very helpful in people's lives. One story that I thought was very illustrative of how she brought her talents from one area to another was a faculty and administration battle at Rice over a projected cut in health benefits. And the university wanted to cut the PPOs because they thought that number one, it was too expensive, and number two, it benefited wealthy faculty. And so she was able to pull for the facts together and found that it really was only marginally more expensive, and the people who used it were staff. And so ended up winning that battle. And as she was able to deliver for all of her constituents, which were so many. Yet at the same time, she was devoted to her family. She was very taken with the ballet career of Matthew, as Gary talked about. That Jerry said that when Matthew was 5 and went to the Nutcracker, that he was very interested in ballet, and she did everything possible to help his career, and enjoyed it greatly and thrived with it. So she was a person who had more hours in a day and a week than we had, but that we are very, very sorry to lose her because she touched so many of us in so many ways.
Okay, thanks, Martha. And now shifting a little bit to the perspective of someone who was her student and mentee, Lara Brown.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks to all of you. It's really wonderful to hear. I'm going to try to get over my initial trepidation of to call her Lyn. I mean, despite being a full professor myself at this point, I still think of her as Professor Ragsdale. I came from UCLA to the University of Arizona as a PhD student in the fall of 1993. I had the great good fortune of having a class with Lyn Ragsdale, and I would say that it is in so many ways really because of her that I am a Presidency scholar at all. So how this kind of evolved, and it evolved very oddly. I was at Arizona for 2 years. I did a master's there. I had a class with Professor Rusk. I learned a lot. And then I went back to UCLA, where I was then basically suggested that I should be doing Congress because the presidency wasn't systematic enough. I did that at UCLA. But after I left UCLA, after I did my dissertation on congressional scandals, so much of Lyn's work and her understanding that the presidency could be thought about in a systematic fashion in ways that involved both quantitative and qualitative data, to bring this institution kind of up to par with the rest of the discipline, is really in so many ways why I went back to the presidency. And I will tell you that I have her, this is like very dog-eared from my fall of 1993, taking her class. And what makes me laugh when I look at this book is in the very first sentence I wrote back then in the margin in 1993, I like this already. And what is so interesting to me as I look back on Lyn's work and I think about her model, she was this powerful, determined, amazing scholar and woman. I was terrified of her. I'll be quite frank. I had been an undergraduate at UCLA who was something of a late bloomer when it came to scholarly work. I really didn't know what I didn't know. And I worked with Lyn as a graduate student. I went to the library and poured through the presidential papers and helped collect some of those statistics for the second edition of The Elusive Executive. And all of that was really just tremendous training because she helped me see that, you know, as much as the presidency was a symbolic kind of office full of sort of emotional public expectation, it could also be analyzed rigorously and thoughtfully. And like I said, I can honestly tell you that when I think about the 2 books I've written on the presidency, I think so much of them is owed to that idea. Because while, you know, Vital Statistics and all the work she did with Gary King was about trying to do comparative work and trying to make these presidents different, I also, in my own work, tried to say, wait a minute, they're all also winners. So maybe they're all also the same. But I would not have been able to think about the presidents as a unit or a group of people who won a certain office and resided in that office if I had not had that sort of early impression and training from her that you have to look at more than just the N of one. You have to think about what these people do, how they act, and what kinds of kind of work product they are engaged in on a daily basis. And when you start doing that, then whole worlds of new ideas open up about how presidents do what they do. And I just, like I said, I'm deeply indebted to Lyn. She was on my committee for my orals. And again, I was terrified. I remember she said to me, well, Lara, you've done a good job reading the canon, but have you read recent APSRs? Have you, you know, and I was nervous. I mean, I stayed up all night long and I somehow passed my orals. And then I know from Helen Ingram, who had been my actual chair, she told me that Lyn said later, well, I think she kind of crammed. And I think she was right. I had so much to learn, and she was such a model of all that I should aspire to be. So I'm grateful to her, the work that she did, and the model that she, because so much of, I think, who I am and who I've tried to be is because of what I saw her be when I was at the University of Arizona.
Thanks, Lara. And to end at least this part of of our presentations, her colleague at Rice, Paul Brace.
Thank you, Dan. This is a sad occasion, but I, like the others on the panel, am honored to have been invited to speak about Lyn Ragsdale. I became familiar with Lyn long before I knew her. She and I entered the profession in a pretty bad year. 81, 82 was, speaking of the presidency, arguably an economy that cost Carter his presidency. After being in the profession 40 years, I'm not sure any year is a great year to go on the job market, but that one was particularly bleak. I don't know what was the most coveted job that year, but I think Arizona was easily in the top handful. And Lyn scored that appointment. And of course, I didn't know her, but I already envied her. That was a very good job to have. And how did she get it? Well, I would later learn from reading Jacobson and Cornell, who cited prominently an AP article she wrote while she was in graduate school, which at the time was very unusual to publish while you're in graduate school. That certainly helped. And she also had in her quiver her APS article on speeches that she would unleash on the world and hit the ground running at Arizona. My familiarity with Lyn would grow, even though, again, we hadn't met. We didn't go to grad school together, but sometimes I felt like we did. Part of this was due to Gary King, and I had the good fortune of overlapping 1 year with Gary at NYU while they were writing The Elusive Executive. And later, partly due to Gary and just good fortune, Barbara Hinckley came to NYU, who had played a large role, I think, in Lyn and Gary and Robert and other people's careers. And Barbara was an extraordinary person to work with. And I learned a lot about Lyn and that miraculous Madison cohort that seems to keep cropping up in our talk. So again, I felt like I knew Lyn, but I had never met her. She would become editor of PRQ, and I had a graduate student at the time who got to revise and resubmit there. And I became very impressed with her patience and willingness to work. He was obviously a graduate student. Nobody had ever heard of him. He's done well. But she, as editor, went the extra distance to help him. It was very a promising paper, but it took her good efforts as an editor to bring it to its full fruition. And I think she showed that kind of attention to an anonymous grad student that seems to have come through in other people's experiences with Lyn, both as a mentee and as colleagues or co-authors and so forth. I actually get to meet Lyn sometime later. I had a mentee at a department where, to be frank, the bombs and rockets crew, graduate students, had turned the departmental lab into sort of a man cave and had decided to install Playboy screensavers on the department's computers. And she thought that was objectionable, and so did I. And rather than get them taken off, we were trying to think of a creative way that she could maybe improve the climate among the graduate students. And she had a great idea, and I agreed. We should bring a leading woman scholar in with her graduate. She was the president of the Graduate Association. Bring a leading woman scholar in to give a talk. And she did. And Lyn was willing, and it was a lot of connecting flights. I won't say where I was because I don't want to incriminate the people who put those Playboy screensavers on there, but it was a long way from Tucson, Arizona, let us say, with lots of connecting flights. But yeah, Lyn was then still young. We're roughly the same age. She was willing to make the long flight. She came. It was wonderful. She gave a great talk about what it is to be a professional, a great talk about how professionals fit into the bigger scheme of things, about where scholarship fits into the bigger world of things. It was great. It couldn't have been better. Importantly, however, that grad student made an important connection with Lyn and would later be hired by the University of Arizona, where she would get an NSF career grant I'd like to think I helped a little bit on that, but I'll tell you what, Lyn Ragsdale was an enormous help with her getting a very coveted NSF career grant. And so I got to meet Lyn, and we got to go out to dinner and do all the normal things. And from that point on, we would talk periodically, and we'd get together for dinner or drinks at professional conferences. And I, as everyone here did, truly enjoyed her personality and her company. I became aware, my many places I've been, I was at the University of Illinois, Chicago. I was aware they were looking for a chair, and I was aware Lyn was a candidate for it. I was delighted to hear that they had hired Lyn, and I heard nothing but good things about her time there. And it was extraordinary for them to have her there, and I think she helped that department move along substantially in her relatively brief period there. When the deanship at Rice came open, I could think of no one I would have rather had put their hat in the ring than Lyn Ragsdale. And I was exceptionally happy, as was everyone, well, almost everyone in the department, that Lyn was selected to be the new dean. She was pathbreaking. She was the first woman dean of our college, but notably too, she was the first outsider. All the other deans in the roughly 5-decade history of our college had been insiders, and they've done a good job, and we had a good college. But I think perspective and the kinds of things that people have mentioned here about Lyn's innate understanding of administration and the geography of university politics were an extraordinary attribute to bring to Rice. And she became dean and implemented, I would call her a hurricane of fresh air. She implemented many much needed procedures and processes that improved the academic climate. She was instrumental in bringing a very well-funded Kinder Institute to the college. She helped secure the editorship of the American Journal of Political Science in the political science department. She also helped establish the Texas Policy Lab, which is in the economics department. And she also established the Masters of Global Affairs with the Baker Institute, which is carrying on, but which I know she wanted to become deeply involved with going forward. So she brought extraordinary change and improvements to Rice, and it's an exciting new era there. And I think she had a great deal to do with it. After her extensive labors as dean, I know she wanted to settle back into her research career. Her and Jerry's book just came out. And so it's tragic that we've lost her at this point, but I don't think we need to dwell on our mourning. We have, in this panel, celebrated her many, many accomplishments that will last well into the future, as many people pointed on. And so to Jerry, Matthew, and her sister Tracy, I think I, like others, offer condolences. And Lyn is sorely missed, but every day we see evidence of her presence.
Thanks, Paul. Before we open it up, maybe just a conversation even among the panelists, or to open it up to, we have some audience members. I think Paul brought up her APSR article on speech making. I remember, again, being at an APSA. It was not long after that article, Karen, that actually you and Chuck and I think Tom Wico had written about qualitative methods in the presidency, and there was a panel, and she was on it. You know, another thing for those of you who don't know, and for Matthew or presidency scholars, I think we've kind of gotten past it a little bit, but we've had per capita more panels at APSAs about how we should study our discipline, I think, than probably any other discipline. And that was one of them. And I remember, Karen, you might have even been on this panel. It was about how to study, and she was on there, and she said, she was talking about that speech writing article. And I remember her saying, you know, okay, I'm the quantitative person on this panel. You know, she talked a little bit about that, and she said, and what was it? And she kind of opened it up to everybody, and she said, what was the problem with that? And nobody said, and she goes, no, I can take it, go ahead. It's atheoretical. And I remember thinking, well, so what? You know, it might have been a theoretical. I don't know that I would necessarily agree with that, but I actually use it as an example to my students about how, even if it was a theoretical, how a piece of exploratory research can be very sophisticated and have a huge impact on the discipline, because that opened a veritable cottage industry of research on presidential communication, of which speech making is only one part. And the other thing that I did want to mention as well, and it might have been the reason that PEP President Mina Bose had asked me to put this together, is because I mentioned it to her one other time. And when I'd heard that Lyn had passed last December, it was like for many, even though, like I said, I didn't know her very well, it was kind of a surreal moment, because I think, Martha, you had mentioned that her Vital Statistics book had won the Neustadt Prize for reference work. And I literally had on my computer a draft nominating Lyn's book for the Legacy Award. And last December, and I was getting ready to turn it in, or email it for whatever the deadline was, probably in January or February. And I cannot imagine, it is for a person or a work for a living scholar, but I do find it absolutely inconceivable that had she lived, that would not have won, if not on the first shot, at some point it would have been, because as even just the few of us who were talking about it here, it certainly has had a long life, moving on from and continuing the work she did with Gary, which I still have on my shelf as well. And then and ending with the 2014, I think the 4th edition. So I just wanted to mention that as well. So with that, I would like to open it up for anybody else in the audience who might want to have a comment or a question, or even a conversation among the panelists, or however we want to proceed.
So one other quick thing I should mention, my other big memory from that year of being a research assistant for Lyn was that I had come from UCLA, and obviously she had done all of her work at Wisconsin, and UCLA and Wisconsin played in the Rose Bowl in 1994 in January, and Wisconsin prevailed in sort of good, back then, Big Ten tradition. And it was devastating for me, because not only was I, like I said, this sort of not knowledgeable, lost graduate student, but now the university that I had affiliated with had a beat down at the Rose Bowl. I was just aghast. But I can tell you, Lyn was delighted. I remember, the Wisconsin sweatshirts and a lot of red all around campus for a few weeks.
I have a question.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
And that is, does anyone know how far she got on her book Shattered, and what the premise was, and what's going to happen with it?
I don't know, but she's writing with Jerry, so I hope Jerry finishes it.
I think, I'm sorry, I'm Ashley Leeds. I'm the one of Lyn's colleagues at Rice as well. And I know Jerry and Tracy are hoping that they can work with the book. I don't know if Jerry wants to say anything, but certainly they hope that work will live on.
Good.
I don't mean to put anyone on the spot, but I thought we'd see if I see that outgoing president. Oh, Ashley, did you want to say anything more?
Go ahead with your program. I'm happy to say
we don't at this point. It's open, so please.
I was just going to say that thank you all for all your great memories and discussion of Lyn. They're very inspiring. I think Paul covered a lot of the important things that Lyn did at Rice. One thing I'll say from a personal standpoint, when Lyn arrived to become dean at Rice, I was an associate professor. I was one of 2 tenured women in the Department of Political Science. I had never before had a female superior, not a DGS, not a chair, not a dean, not a provost. And that I didn't realize until it happened how inspiring that was. And I'll tell you that if you talk to the women of a certain age, you know, who were around at that time, it made a huge difference. And Lyn took a real interest in mentoring, and she was a fantastic listener. That's what everybody would talk about, is, you know, how great she was at listening to people as a dean. But I think probably she surprised me again as much when she stepped down from the deanship. So she stepped down from the deanship in 2016. She took a year sabbatical appropriately and was working on her book. And she came back, and one anticipates that after someone's been a dean for 10 years and done very little teaching during that time, that they might rest on their laurels, right? But she came back and she wanted to relearn pedagogy. She wanted to become really involved in the movement for inquiry-based learning. She volunteered to teach Intro to American Politics, which I never would have asked her to do. And when APSA proposed doing a gathering where we got together in Houston, community college, liberal arts college, master's granting and PhD granting faculty to work on teaching initiatives together, Lyn was the first in line, and worked together with community college faculty and others to develop active learning modules for APSA. She did really popular simulations. Students loved her Intro to American Politics class. And she was actually teaching a PhD seminar on political institutions, American political institutions, the semester she passed away. So this is someone who was continuing to learn new things, continuing to make a difference in people's lives, and was so inspired by students. I think that that's the thing that was really meaningful, is that all the things she told us to do when she was dean, she demonstrated that she was willing to do when she became faculty. So thanks so much, everybody. I really enjoyed listening.
Thank you, Ashley. And again, okay, I see Mina's muting herself. I was going to put her on the spot by saying that she is the outgoing president, and is actually the one who wanted to put this together. She'd asked me as the then outgoing president, and so I was wondering, Mina, if you had anything that you'd like to say.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. It means a lot to be here, and just hearing everyone's comments, and especially Ashley, when you just talked about Lyn's teaching after leaving the deanship, it just, which so many people here have stated about working with her, particularly Lara's comments and doing the research on Lyn's work. It was just, it just brought home how much a person's intellectual legacy is more than what the written word is, and that's where this roundtable is just is bringing that to life. I didn't know Lyn well. I knew her through the PEP group. She was unfailingly friendly, encouraging to junior scholars, just a true mentor. And so, Ashley, what you're saying was evident at every PEP Presidents and Executive Politics meeting. You know, I was kind of annoyed. I was trying to kind of stay up on the chat here, and then the autocorrect, Karen, I did type it right. It was autocorrected twice incorrectly. But I just wanted to, you know, I just thought that when Dan was discussing the qualitative versus quantitative research and her ability to bridge those methodologies so skillfully and so with such appreciation for the value of different types of empirical research. When we learned, just the such sad news last December, Dan had mentioned, I knew that Dan it was easy to nominate Lyn for the Legacy Award in our section, and we certainly would have done so again. But when we learned the news, we knew immediately that we wanted to honor her in our section. And I think everyone knows that this is actually an APSA panel. When our division chair brought it to APSA, they immediately made it one of the conference roundtables, so that it would be kind of more highly visible. And incidentally, I just want to say, I think Lyn would appreciate this. I stayed off screen, I was listening, but we actually have a presidency panel going on at the same time, and so I'm logged in on my phone. But I've been messaging the people on that to let them know that this is what's going on. But I think she would appreciate the data collection, even though APSA says audience doesn't matter, but you never know with the numbers. But I guess it just means so much to see everyone here and hear just Martha talking about her research, and Gary working with her on the elusive executive, and just everyone. I mean, Dan, you and I have spoken many times about how essential Lyn's empirical volumes were for all of us in presidency studies, and continue to be. And it's a lasting legacy. And this roundtable personalizes that legacy in a way that I'm very grateful that we have the opportunity to do that and to bring us all together. So I guess I just wanted to say thank you to Dan for organizing this, and to everyone for taking the time to join.
Thanks, Mia. Yeah, Nancy, go ahead.
So I did not know Lyn well. I mean, I do recall I would go to the Western meetings, and I do remember that she was president of the Western Political Science Association. And when she was the PEP president, I remember she was basically just a ball of action. I mean, she was just nonstop. So as I said, I didn't know her personally very well, but I do. I wanted to follow up on Karen's comment about the article, Why the Presidency Needs Political Scientists in the White House. And I use that article in my classes as well. And I kept thinking, when I came across it, on the one hand, I mean, it's a scholarly article, but it's got a very practical, feature. And so it was just you don't find articles like that very often. And so it sort of impresses the students that, oh, really, maybe there is a reason to have political scientists advising the president. And it's lovely to see everybody here. And Gary, as I appreciate the plug for New Paltz, Gary was our most illustrious New Paltz political science alum, and got his start there, but obviously has gone way beyond that. So it's good to see everybody. Thank you all for putting this together. It's nice for me, since I did not know her well, to really hear what everybody has to say about her, and just how much of an impact her work really has made on our profession. So, and Mina, I actually had to make a choice between this panel or the other panel, and it was a hard choice. And I thought, no, I think I really want to do this. So I'm glad I did. Thank you.
Does anybody else have anything that they'd like to say or add or ask or comment on?
Dan, I don't know if it was said at the beginning, I might have missed it, but I know that the celebration of Lyn's life is I think it's scheduled for January or February of 22. Ashley, is there, I saw something online, but I wasn't sure if a date had been confirmed.
Yes, it's actually, I believe it's February 24th. I'll check that right now, and I'll put it in the chat. There is going to be a celebration on campus at Rice on February 24th in person. At this point, I don't think we have any plans to stream, but of course, who knows with COVID? I think these days we're waiting to see. But the plan is, we had put off the in-person celebration until people get together safely, and of course are importantly working around the ballet season. So we're hoping that Lyn's friends and family and colleagues will be together to celebrate her life in February.
Thank you. Anything else? Karen?
I know that we've mentioned it. The other thing that increasingly struck me as well, especially when I went from being a political science department chair to being chair of a public administration policy chair and then back and forth, was Lyn's great capacity to think about bringing what we could call the real world of politics and academia together. And I think that bridging is something we need to keep remembering, perhaps as political scientists in the current context in the United States. And that's there in the MGA at Rice, but it also reflects, I think, what she did as a congressional fellow, an award-winning congressional fellow, I don't think we mentioned, in 1990-91. But throughout her work, she really did try to reach out to the broader community and bring some of what we know and think about as political scientists, not only to students, but to larger groups, journalists, local groups, civic groups, and others. And I think that's maybe important for us to remember as political scientists as well.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I think one of the things that is also true in her work was that she was very good about understanding a president in his time. So that historical sense about how important that president's sort of persona or the image, right, that singular executive, how much the public really saw that and held that, even if, upon reflection, we look back at presidents and we're like, oh, Millard Fillmore, right? But at that time, Millard Fillmore was still the president.
Good point. I'll probably steal that actually in some class someday when I mentioned Millard Fillmore. I said, yeah, we don't remember him much, but at that time. So anyone else? All right, well, again, to Jerry and Matthew, our deepest condolences and sympathies. We have all lost a friend, a pioneering scholar, a mentor, and I hope that this recording, I guess it will be available.